First, I would like to thank the Arthritis Foundation and the FDA for having me here to share my voice and my perspective. Um, I am representing the patient voice here, but I'm also representing the quote unquote young person's voice with OA. A lot of the research that I have found, focuses on young adults. It's still 40 plus, and so it's very important to me for someone who was diagnosed in their 20s that OA was actively progressing in their adolescence and teenage years that I bring this issue to light. I'm sure everyone in this room already knows that, but as a patient, I would like to see more focus being given to this area. Um, and as well as, the consideration of the unintended effects of clinical trials and research and things of that nature. I think Tim mentioned a lot about the brain and perception of pain and things of that nature. And when I'm a social work student, but so when we talk about mental health and the implications of mental health for people suffering with OA, and then we couple pain in there as well. It just brings so many layers to the disease and so many components that I think we need to consider from the patient's aspects when we talk about outcome measures and things of that nature. I am here to offer my perspective. Any questions you all may have, I'm here to answer and offer. And I just want to throw a disclosure out there. This is my perspective. I have a weight bearing OA in my knees. I can't speak for someone who may have, OA in smaller joints like the hands and things of that nature. So I am only one voice, but I feel very honored to represent a whole community of OA patients. And I hope to share some of my concerns with clinical trials and unattended effects, and how much I very, very much appreciate this work that everyone in this room is so ambitious about and passionate about, because it's important.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. We definitely count on you to share your voice as the discussion goes forward. David, would you like to make a few comments to start us off?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I'm not exactly sure how granular or in the weeds to get here, but let me just raise a few things that came up in the discussions. I think Tim perceptively noted that it's going to be very challenging to come up with something, and I think Marc in this Preferman data also highlighted this. It's going to be very challenging to come up with treatments that affect both pain and structure. And I don't know that the FDA approach or any approach we've talked about does that in ways that are likely to be terribly successful. And I'm not sure I don't mean to say there is such a magical approach. I'm not sure there is. I wanted to make a suggestion that the group might consider a hierarchical analytic approach, which would, and it's sort of, the FDA sort of already takes this approach in many ways, which is to say the primary outcome here is patient pain and function. That's what we care most about, and that's what patients need to experience with this treatment. And if you reach significance on a pre-specified primary outcome that relates to pain and function, then as a secondary outcome, we might give you the opportunity to ask for a structure claim, but only if that primary is positive. And that would solve some of the problems we've been talking about, but it may be that there's no such treatment that could accomplish that. But I just want to throw that out as an idea. I'm nervous that a variety of companies are going to try to pursue and want to pursue something where they make both structure and pain claims. And I agree with Tim. I think this is going to be pretty challenging. If pain gets a lot better, people walk on it more, they damage it more, and structure can get worse. And so the two may not go together longitudinally. So let me start it off with that. I actually also have some granular suggestions about the FDA version and other ways of assessing pain, but I sort of thought those were less critical. Let me quickly say to Yura Kim, wonderful idea. You can reduce the number needed, as has been done in rheumatoid arthritis, by increasing the initial pain requirement. So you took all of those who were in the progression cohort in OAI, and their range of WOMAC pain at baseline is very wide. You could require that people have a WOMAC pain score of 6 or greater, 7 or greater, and then the number required for these trials would be much less. That's a reasonable way of getting at the numbers challenge that is part of what happened as you did your analysis. And then there's a variety of other ways of evaluating pain that we haven't used in OA and that we should be using in trials, including activity-evoked pain, both walking and staircase-evoked pain. There's wonderful recent work on staircase-evoked pain, which is very sensitive to change outcome and is likely more sensitive to change than WOMAC. And I suggest that we begin thinking about that. So sorry to take up too much time.
No, those are very valuable comments. Thank you, David. Becky, would you go next? And then we'll have the two industry representatives give brief comments. Becky?
Sure. Are you able to hear me okay?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, great. So thanks. I want to start again just by applauding the speakers that we've heard throughout the day already. The presentations leading up to this one really did a great job in setting the stage for the questions that we're grappling with in this session, where we're speaking specifically about how to assess the disease progression in a drug development setting. So I think, we've discussed that there are several challenges that remain, and specifically in the last session, we heard a lot about the challenges with using biomarkers as surrogate endpoints for drug development and clinical trials. However, I think that there is a path forward for identifying clinical endpoints. And when I say that, I refer to, as it's come up several times today, the direct measures of how a patient feels or functions or survives, as we discussed joint replacement. And I feel that there are ways that we can reliably and feasibly evaluate effectiveness using those outcomes. And I think you heard that from Dr. Kim, as well as a few others kind of alluding to this type of approach. And then, and just not to take up too much time, I'd like to emphasize that those long-term randomized controlled trials are really what will be necessary to provide the evidence that we need to confirm a long-term patient benefit and to ensure that the magnitude of the benefit really outweighs any risks of a new osteoarthritis intervention. So I think it's necessary that we think through the possibilities and ways to increase the feasibility of conducting these trials, as they're going to be critical.
Thanks very much, Becky. Angelika, I wonder if we could ask you to please talk about what you see as the elements of a successful osteoarthritis drug development program, and then what you see as some of the obstacles. Angelika?
Thank you, Jeff, for that question. The views I'm expressing today are my own. To date, no DMOD has been successfully developed despite significant efforts. And one of the challenges has been the requirement for an endpoint of total knee replacement. And as Dr. Kim has just nicely presented, using time to total knee replacement as an endpoint requires a study that is very large with a long follow-up time. In general, as we develop therapies, we need to conduct a phase 2 trial to find the appropriate dose and 2 adequate and well-controlled phase 3 trials to establish effectiveness. As such, we need even longer time to fully develop a drug and many more patients than just the patients that Dr. Kim stated for a single trial. So I would like to highlight that we really look forward to collaborating with the FDA, the Arthritis Foundation, academia, patients organization to develop improved clinical endpoints for OA. We share a goal to develop better therapies for osteoarthritis. Now, from a sponsor perspective, I think most importantly is the establishment of a clinically meaningful endpoint, as you have highlighted, to describe when a patient has reached a severe disease status that describes how a patient feels, functions, or joint survives. Establishment of the minimal clinically important difference for this endpoint will be critical for us. With such an acceptable endpoint and the development of the clinically important difference, sponsors can then design clinical trials to develop disease-modifying drugs. This will allow us to assess the efficacy and safeties of drugs. In the absence of a goalpost like that, development of new drugs are truly difficult. Let me just add in general, and we've discussed that to date, development of a surrogate endpoint or identification of biomarkers that predict severe OA or end-stage OA would be very important to us. This will allow development of clinically meaningful and statistically significant drugs for OA in a timelier manner, and in my view is critical. Currently, there are not a lot of drugs being developed for osteoarthritis, and one of the reasons for that is how lengthy and how large these clinical trials are. We look forward to FDA to really partner with them as sponsors to advance the treatment of disease-modifying therapies for OA. Lastly, as you've asked about potential hurdles, I think, and this has already been mentioned, is we need to advance clinical trials that have designs that can better manage the placebo effect, which has also been an impediment to really developing new and better therapies for OA. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share my views.
Thank you very much, Angelika. Very valuable perspective. Jeymi, would you offer your thoughts on the same question? What makes up a successful OA drug development program and some potential obstacles?
Sure, Jeff, thank you. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to participate here. And again, these views are my own and not those of BioSplice. So as we know, osteoarthritis is endotypically heterogeneous, leading to a final structural phenotype that is common. And so I think the first step is to developing a good drug program is to really understand your drug. From a mechanistic point of view, a foundation of mechanistic studies means that you can then plan your development program on identifying certain endotypes and stratifying drugs, your trials in that way. Or you take, if your drug affects multiple targets and multiple processes in osteoarthritis, then you can target a more generalized OA approach and try and refine that down. So that then sets the sets the tenor of how you're going to define your development program. Then it's very important to read the research guidelines and the literature and find out what has worked and what hasn't worked. And there's a huge graveyard of OA drugs to draw experience on. And I would say that two critical pieces of reading are the ORSI 2015 clinical trials guidance and also the paper that Virginia Krause et al. Published in 2019 on concept clinical designs for OA, which was very important. Thought leader input is really important, and also, if possible, early interaction with FDA is also critical to find out whether your thinking on your development program is aligned with what they see. And then with your drug, having identified the mechanism and having identified potential clinical benefit, as developers, we have to keep our eyes on the prize, which is what are the FDA indications to aim for when defining our outcomes and then using the tools to measure these outcomes. And so we know that the two indications that are possible are treatment of pain of OA and treatment of OA. So treatment of pain OA is a more straightforward path. The target population is better defined, and to speak to what Tuhina was saying earlier, we understand now that patients with unilateral symptoms And then if you use a scale like the widespread pain index to remove comorbid pain as a compounding factor, and then interestingly fixing joint space width at baseline, which not only reduces heterogeneity of KL grading, but we have shown it to have an effect on pain responsivity as well. And this has been proved, this has been now shown not only by data from our group, but also by other groups as well. So we're seeing a pain phenotype that can respond. So ironically, even though you may have a disease modifying candidate drug, it may just be better to just go for the pain indication and then build out your label further on in your development program with structural evidence. However, if you're going for the treatment of OA, if pain isn't the primary outcome of clinical benefit for your drug, then you have to show effects on function and on structure measures as well. And this is where we start hitting the obstacles. Objective functional outcomes have been largely overlooked by sponsors. And then the structural measure that everyone has been using as an outcome has been total knee replacement or knee replacement. And as we know, MRI and X-ray as predictors of these are no better than one another. They're pretty much identical, despite the enhanced sensitivity of MRI. Then further obstacles that we hit are recruitment time as well. So if you over-define your population when you're screening for them, you end up with high screen rate failure rates, and this increases your recruitment time, which can become unacceptable. And sometimes just because you get more information at screening, it doesn't necessarily mean it's better information. And having good randomization and sufficient sample size will reduce the imperfections in your screening so that you reduce the risk of heterogeneity and bias between your treatment arms and placebo arms. So this is really important. Then also for long trials as well, patient retention is important, so you have to think about that. And there's undoubtedly an issue with drugs that benefit structure only. It's problematic to define the clinical benefit. And we know that knee replacement, though highly sensitive, is not a good clinical trial outcome. And so now looking at these more open measures of joint failure or end-stage disease or unacceptable and acceptable patient states are welcoming for us as sponsors, because now that actually gives us a target that it may not be a perfect target right now, but it's something we can aim to develop into an outcome and endpoints. And just to reiterate what Dr. Jahreis was saying, that there's an abundance of biomarkers, but a paucity of surrogate endpoints. So we have to somehow breach that gap and develop some surrogate endpoints. And hopefully we get more answers from initiatives like FNIH to help do that. So that's really what I've got to say.
Thank you very much, Jeymi. Ali, do you want to take over and kick off our questions?
Sure. Shall I begin with the one that you highlighted earlier, or shall I go back to the original list that I have with 1, 2, 3, 5 questions? Yeah, I'll go to the session 3 master list of questions. Okay. We've prepared a series of questions to facilitate this discussion. I'm going to start with the first one. Given that there are external factors that may impact the decision to proceed with joint replacement, such as comorbidities, socioeconomic factors, etc., could you create virtual joint replacement criteria as a long-term clinical endpoint for a trial? And what criteria would be important to include in this context? So maybe I should direct that question to Angelika.
Thank you very much. I think comorbidities and socioeconomic factors certainly impact treatment decisions and outcomes for many diseases, and yet drugs are successfully developed to treat these diseases. As examples, so we can look at cardiovascular disease in RA or metabolic syndrome in psoriasis. and comorbidities and socioeconomic status can be balanced across the treatment arms. So from a sponsor perspective, the definition of severe OA and end-stage osteoarthritis is most important to us. This definition will enable the assessment, as I said before, of a drug-effective effect on the progression of osteoarthritis. And we believe that the paper that has been presented by Dr. Kim is a combination of measurable thresholds as a composite endpoint would be a good approach and a good first start when we think about the development of endpoints for osteoarthritis.
Thank you, Angelika. But doesn't the trial design need to depend on the mechanism of action of the compound or the biological being investigated? And Marc Hochberg gave a very nice presentation about how that worked in the case of sprifermin. In fact, he has his hand up, and I would like to ask Marc to unmute himself and make a comment and perhaps ask his question as well.
Well, I want to comment on your question that Angelika already responded to, and maybe take the opportunity for a little historical perspective on the need to develop an outcome other than total joint replacement for long-term structure modification, let's call it disease modification studies in osteoarthritis, because we're following the Tim McAlindon approach here to consider the disease a combination of both structure and signs and symptoms, or illness, as Orsi has called it. So Omeract and Orsi worked together starting probably in the latter part of the last decade to develop an outcome measure called indication for total joint replacement, and presented some preliminary sort of Delphi things at Omeract in the past, and then started a study which ended up enrolling approximately 1,100 people with either symptomatic knee osteoarthritis or symptomatic hip osteoarthritis, who presented to orthopedic surgeons. And the orthopedic surgeon made the decision to operate or not to operate. So that was the outcome. And then they looked at a number of symptom and self-reported PROs, as well as radiographs when available. And Lori Gossick and others published this in, I think, Osteoarthritis and Cartilage, probably about 12 or 13 years ago, and set up a null hypothesis that the area under the curve for prediction had to be greater than 0.65, okay? And we heard this morning about biomarkers that are now being qualified, which don't predict with an area under the curve of greater than 0.65. And if I recall, a single DEXA doesn't predict hip fracture with an area under the curve of greater than 0.65. In any event, they were unable to reject the null hypothesis because the WOMAC score for pain had an AUC of 0.64. The WOMAC score for function had an AUC of about 0.63. When the hips and the knees were lumped together. A subsequent reanalysis of these data, more recently published in OA and C, showed that if you look at the total score, then the total score on the WOMAC actually predicts the decision for total joint replacement, but there was no real cutoff that could be used. So this has been approached in the past. I had a graduate student in statistics analyze the same data set using classification and regression trees. And she used this agnostic approach and actually found that the Coos quality of life scale was the best individual PRO to predict the decision to do a total joint replacement. A KOOS quality of life score of less than 35, where 100 is excellent quality of life, 0 is terrible quality of life, was the best individual PRO to predict total joint replacement. So, this has been looked at for 15 plus years. And while David, I think, makes an excellent suggestion that you can reduce the sample size by recruiting people with higher pain scores at baseline, those individuals, if they fail to respond in terms of a pain response, are much more likely to either reach the outcome if they haven't already achieved the outcome at the time they were entered into the study. So it's going to be a tension between enrolling people who are symptomatic but haven't yet achieved the outcome into a study where they're at high risk of achieving that outcome. That's my comment.
Thank you, Marc. And I'd like to apologize to Philip because he did have these two studies highlighted at the end of his presentation. So if I may just ask Philip to comment, and then we go to David Felson.
Yeah, I think a couple of things to say. Firstly, I'm not sure our surrogate endpoint, if it's a TJR or if it's a severe state, I'm not sure that is mechanism dependent for a study. Those things to me seem like a fracture in an osteoporosis trial. It seems like that's an endpoint that is irrespective of your mechanism. Where the mechanism might be important is with respect to tissue, let's say cartilage or bone, which are the ones that have been studied most so far. And again, I'm not so sure that even is mechanistic specific. Bone shape, we know, changes irrespective of whether you've got a target that's affecting bone or cartilage. It's a marker of the global knee joint process. So I think both the imaging, and if I'm interpreting right what I hear today, and I think this is what FDA has said before, that to have an imaging surrogate, it would need, at least in the first instance, to be embedded in a trial with one of these other endpoints to show its relationship to these other endpoints down the line. But I'll separate an imaging structural endpoint with predictive validity from these hard endpoints of TJR plus severe state, which I think is a separate thing. But I don't think they would need to be mechanism dependent for companies developing different sort of action drugs. And just a quickie to say, David's very right about what would go in the progression cohort. Some of the progression cohort have no symptoms and have no OA, indeed, when you look at them in detail. So I think you could make those figures even better.
Thank you, Philip. David, would you like to follow that up?
Yeah, I think the idea of looking at either end of the road, what Tim called end of the road, or virtual joint replacement, similar ideas, has a couple of potential drawbacks that I think just in making the decision on the part of the FDA, they need to consider the pros and cons of each of these. If you do it this way, what is likely to happen is you're going to recruit into trials people with quite severe advanced disease, and it'll be questionable as to how this, if there's an effect on pain, how that is relevant, or whether it generalizes to everyone with pain and not just those at the severe level. The other issue is it's a dichotomous outcome. And in rheumatoid arthritis, we went through this. What happens with the dichotomous outcome is you compromise power. You have less power. We're now using continuous outcomes in osteoarthritis pain trials, and that gives us more power. And one of the reasons why the Kim article shows the sample sizes are so impressively large is that she's requiring a dichotomous outcome in order for us to avoid that dichotomous outcome, in order for us to get significant efficacy. And it works okay in rheumatoid arthritis now, because we have a lot of effective therapies and we want to we want to ask for large trials to be able to distinguish treatment effects. It doesn't work so well in osteoarthritis, where we really don't have a lot of wonderful effective therapies. And it would be helpful to know if therapies are modestly different with respect to continuous outcomes. So from a statistical / clinical epidemiologic perspective, I'm not sure how well it works.
Thank you very much, David. I believe Daniel has his hand up. Daniel, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I just want to give a cautionary note that finding a subgroup of people in a large observational database that have high pain and saying that's a subgroup that might be targeted, you have to be really careful about taking that into a clinical trial, because even in large observational trials that we and others have been involved in pain, it takes 2 to 3 months for people to come back to their mean, to get rid of regression to the mean. And in fact, as someone who's looked at a ton of pain trials, I think about 2/3 of what we call the placebo effect is regression to the mean, and 1/3 is a true placebo effect. And so I just be cautioned that the one way of getting those high pain people is to really get them when they're at their worst, and then you're gonna, the problem you'll have is a really high placebo effect rate that you'll have to mitigate against. And I don't think we've, in the broader pain field, really done a good enough job of getting rid of regression to the mean. At most, we have a 1 or 2 week run-in period. That's not long enough to get rid of the natural history of these conditions is longer. And if we really wanted to get rid of regression to the mean with a run-in, it would have to be longer than a week or 2.
Ali, I wonder if this might be a good time to go on to the second question about enrichment designs. Would that be okay?
Yes, of course. So the second question is going to be of interest to the biomarker experts. Can the panel discuss strategies to improve feasibility of a study, such as enrichment strategies or innovative trial designs? And this should include discussion of the role of biomarkers for the purpose of enrichment. So I'm now thinking whether I can bring Dr. Kraus into this conversation from the previous session. Virginia, would you like to join us?
I am happy to. Thank you. Well, that question plays right into my hand, of course, because I think that what we were presenting were markers that could definitely impact the ability to enrich trials for progressors. And that would, if we feed into Yura's, beautiful presentation, if we could hit the study design from both ends, improve the beginning and the end, maybe that will reduce the cost, reduce the numbers needed to treat to get to a satisfactory endpoint to show that the drug worked. So I really think that we have underplayed the potential for enrichment biomarkers in our disease trials.
Thank you, Virginia. And I'd like to apologize to Tim. I didn't see your hand up, Tim.
I didn't know if it's a virtual hand up or an actual hand up, because I can't see a function there. I did have a couple of quick comments, and I can speak to also the concept of enrichment. I think that we are, this pain is all self-inflicted by our insistence on, firstly, using structure as a component of requirement for disease modification. And secondly, our obsession with the WOMAC, which is an instrument that's full of imperfections in terms of long-term studies. I think we get rid of function. Function, it should be an entrance criterion, but we shouldn't require it. Structure should be an entrance criterion and not something that needs to change. Rather, we should define disease modification in terms of patient-orientated states, and it shouldn't be at a single time point. That's the other problem. You could envisage longitudinal measures of patient state using more contemporary patient-centered global measures like acceptable symptom states, measure them recurrently and kind of construct an area under the curve, you could envisage medium and long-term disease modification. The reality is if you achieve good pain relief, you might actually accelerate structural progression. So you have to look at the whole trajectory. And so that's my thought about disease modification. That would make things hugely easier for industry, and it would lower the bar, and it would be a patient-centered indication of disease modification. With regard to enrichment, you know, I generally get it. It makes sense. We need to either enrich the population with progressors or somehow find people who have accelerated disease. But my concern, on the other hand, is that by doing so, we might also engender, you know, a sample that's not responsive to the intervention, in which there's actually therapeutic futility. So I think that speaks to the biomarker perspective that you have to be cognizant of the target here. So you know, I just put that out as a caveat in regards to enrichment.
Could I just add to what you said, Tim? I think it was you that said cartilage is not a measure of the disease process. And I think I just wanted to add to that some of the biochemical markers, which actually are derived from the cartilage, are giving an activity measure, a measure of cartilage degeneration that's ongoing in real time. And so, and part of the process, and not only that, but they serve as disease associated molecular patterns that activate the pro-inflammatory responses of the synovial component of the joint. So I think that we underestimate the ability of the molecular measures and some of the measures Sharmila was talking about to actually measure the disease pathophysiology, the molecular aspects of the disease.
Well, Virginia, that may be so, but I think that's the other thing, is we really have to figure out the sequence of pathological events in osteoarthritis, because we're still stuck on this idea that hyaline cartilage damage is the first event. But actually, from a clinical perspective, and you look at MRIs, you know, the first event is a combination of a biomechanical insult on top of tissue that may be already vulnerable, or in the case of major trauma, is healthy tissue. So the cartilage damage, in a sense, is a downstream outcome, probably, of the originated process. That doesn't mean to say that the biomarkers don't accurately reflect that. They might. But it would certainly improve our ability to figure out interventions if we really understood better, you know, the sequence of pathological events that happens in OA, I think.
Thank you, Tim. And perhaps I could ask Dr. Karsdal to make a comment about what might be on the horizon in this area. I mean, Virginia's presentation was very comprehensive and included up-to-date discussion of all the biomarkers that are currently being used. But perhaps I could ask Morten to come into this discussion and talk about some of the other biomarkers that are currently in development, specifically focusing on their potential for enrichment in future clinical trials.
That's a good and a tough question, Ali. I appreciate that. I think it's actually fascinating with Phil's presentation that possibly an anti-inflammatory used for the right patient population could have a clinical benefit. And we actually know from RA that there's quite a few biomarkers that are responding and predictive of radiographic progression. So there can be some harvested from that. And then Virginia talked about the biomarkers from the FNIH consortium, the cartilage biomarkers that predicted progression, but the bone biomarkers are also doing that. So I think it's a combination, right? That we need a bone and a cartilage and inflammation biomarker. I think something along that line.
Thank you, Morten. And Miller makes a very important point about the important biomechanical role of the meniscus, and obviously some of the pathological changes that Tim was just talking about further down the line could be the result of destabilization and problems with the meniscus, which we clearly don't see with some of the radiographic approaches. Sharmila, would you like to say a few comments about that?
I would actually. Some of the things that we've seen is the cartilage lesion prevalence is obviously higher when there's meniscal damage accompanying it. There's been literature on that. Progression, for example, if you consider changes in biochemistry with T1 row and T2, it actually increases in those who already have meniscal lesions. And in the Arthritis Foundation study that we did, for example, in subjects with ACL injury, those subjects who came with degenerated cartilage, the higher the degenerated cartilage, the faster the progression, which sort of makes sense, right? The pathological progression of the relaxation times, of the changes, of the depletion of the biochemistry was higher. So in a way, I think your enrichment could include, if you want to see real progression of lesions, include people with meniscal lesions, include those people who have higher biochemical cartilage degeneration, then perhaps the presence or the stoppage of lesions will be affected by your injury if that's the mechanism that you want to affect. So I think the pathology and the evolution will depend on your target, as well as how all of these tissues interact biomechanically.
Thank you, Sharmila. Did I see any hands up, or are my eyes playing tricks on me? Philip.
Just to make a plea that a couple of other speakers and Tim just raised again, for the issue of structure modification. I've said this to a number of you before. I believe in OA we've gone down a wrong path trying to follow RA when we're always much closer to osteoporosis, a disease where you accumulate damage over a long period of time before you get to a nasty point. And the thought of moving away from changing joint space to changing something that's really important to the patient would be a really great thing, that we change the meaning of disease modification, not away from structure modification. It would be great if structure modification leads to that, but the end point for patients is their symptoms. It's how they feel and function and survive. So I think we should make that the focus of disease modification, and that would be a great philosophical change for us to be heading in that direction. And then we've got a number of putative outcomes, and David and others have talked to them already.
Yes, and of course we need to refocus back onto the seventh commandment of Kim et al., which is total knee replacement plus function and pain. So we need to bring this discussion back into sharp focus on pain and function. So Tim, did you want to continue along the lines that you started?
Or continue my, my monologue. No, I would just resonate with Phil. I think we're on the same track. I think we need a disruptive sort of intervention here about how we think about disease progression and contextualize it in terms of patient-centered outcomes that relate more to state and get away a little bit from WOMAC type instruments, which are a bit problematic. But but on the other hand, I didn't think we're quite there yet. I think it probably requires some more focus groups, some sort of figuring out what are those outcomes and making them also longitudinal as opposed to just a single cross-section.
And I think that would be doable, wouldn't it, in a 2-year trial, to have a number of the last 3 months or something like that you're able to achieve this status, because it's likely people do a little bit of that. And I won't even talk to Dan's point, which is quite absolutely correct about regression to the mean and the things we're not doing and looking at pain well enough. But the status thing could be over a couple of time points or over a prolonged period. I like that concept.
Yes, and that's in Yura Kim's manuscript. You've got 2 consecutive time points there, and also much less vulnerable to regression to the mean. Regression to the mean mostly is a property of pain scales and the fact that we impose eligibility criteria based on that same instrument.
Thank you. So Marc and then David. Marc and then David.
So Ali, what if we get back to the patient-centered outcome of satisfaction and the patient acceptable symptom state, which Tim brought up and has been explored in osteoarthritis more as a outcome measure in trials of analgesic agents, or at least developed in the setting of trials of analgesic agents, and has been discussed as a potential outcome measure in a clinical trial. Certainly not something that the agency would appear to accept given its current regulatory documents, although anything is possible if you have a meeting and discuss it. But, you know, patients can be enrolled in studies with levels of symptoms and physical dysfunction as long as they have the entry structural abnormalities, and then could report whether they have achieved an acceptable symptom state for themselves. This could be patient-centered. It's very individual. It doesn't have to be guarded on a or you know, focused on a particular pain score, and it could be at multiple visits, whether they're 1 month apart, whether they're 3 months apart, as their as clinically relevant outcome.
Thank you, Marc.
Out there.
If it might not be good to turn to some of the questions from the audience. There was a question about responder indices, and the person asking the question was wondering why they hadn't panned out as outcome measures. So I'd like to ask that of the group. And Marc had brought my attention to the ORSI effort to develop alternative measures to total knee replacement, and one was the inverse ORSI-OMERACT criteria. So I wonder if the group could discuss responder indices, if they might be beneficial in long-term studies.
David has his hand up. I don't know if he wants to start off.
David, you're on mute.
David, you're on mute. David, you're muted.
I wanted to just comment that the PASS is also a dichotomous. So we're actually having several different discussions, and it might be helpful to sort of figure out what we want to discuss. One is, or what we want to focus on. One is about structure and pain and combining them. Another is about whether the pain measures we're currently using, most commonly the WOMAC, for longer term and shorter term trials are the best we could use. And in that second discussion, there's been the Yura paper, which is very nice, looking at the extreme worst. There's the PASS approach, which Marc just mentioned, which is looking at the extreme best. Okay, both state issues, not transition issues. Okay, and then there's a responder method, which is like an ACR20 in rheumatoid arthritis speak, which is you know, a transition measure, and it isn't very sensitive to change, so that's partly why it hasn't won very much. So as someone who's now been involved in publishing a bunch of trials in England where we've tested a lot of these things out and published them, the OMERACT ORSI responder criteria don't work very well, and I wouldn't use them. Nothing works so much better than WOMAC to detect the efficacy of a treatment that we ought to automatically discard WOMAC. I mean, it doesn't, WOMAC could be improved upon. What Tim said is absolutely right. And I'd like to hear Dan Claw's view of the sort of the stuff that Tuhina talked about earlier, which is, do we use something like WOMAC for a long-term trial, or is there some kind of shift that occurs in pain reporting over time that makes that insensitive, in which case we have to come up with other measures for long-term trials. But there are alternative short-term trial pain measures. Some of them are activity-induced pain measures. Some of them are patient priority measures. So what hurts you the most okay, is a really good question. Turns out to be very sensitive to change. If you then have a person grade it worked better in our trials than the WOMAC did. And those were trials of positive trials of treatments that were efficacious compared to placebo, which is important. So there are alternatives to WOMAC, but we're not going to cut. It's very unlikely that we're going to come up with short treatments that are efficacious short term that WOMAC completely missed. WOMAC is not that bad. I mean, it's pretty good. You don't do that much better than WOMAC, except maybe long term, which I don't have a sense of. And I guess I did want to defer a little bit to Dan there and ask what his opinion was.
I agree with what you said, David, is that we don't have any good way of knowing that people reset their pain scores over time, but everyone thinks that does happen. And so I think that is, the longer the trial, the harder it is for me to see that, you know, any kind of pain measure is going to be a valid measure at, 3 to 5 years after an intervention. And so I do think that the measures that incorporate pain interference, the WOMAC, I would call the WOMAC functional scale is really what we would call a pain interference measure now. It's really asking the degree to which pain interferes with function. And those measures theoretically should be better over time, because you're asking about specific things in asking of people, how much does pain interfere with your ability to do this, rather than just asking about their pain per se, which again, they may shift their, what they call a 4 out of 10 pain. But I do think that the more objective measures of function really haven't been very well explored in OA, whether it's actigraphy-based ones or again the ones that you've written about, David. That I really think that a combination of a pain interference measure, and again I hate the WOMAC, but I have to agree with you that it's not, even though it has a lot of problems, it's hard to find something that performs a lot better. But I would say something like the WOMAC function measure plus a more objective measure of function might just conceptually be better than anything we're doing right now.
Tim's got his hand up.
Go ahead.
May I speak? Well, just step back a bit. The WOMAC was designed to test efficacy of NSAIDs in 6 to 12 week trials, and it does that exceptionally well. But we're doing meta-analyses as we have across the landscape of OA therapies. We're struck in looking at the WOMAC when you look at 1 or 2 year trials that the pain trajectories of the treated and placebo groups almost always converge. Also within the WOMAC itself, the pain subscale, when it's positive, you occasionally see a blip for stiffness and occasionally for function, but consistently those two subscales perform less well. So the WOMAC is also the comment that there's nothing better. Actually, numeric rating scales asked daily and average over the week perform better than the WOMAC, even in the short-term trials. So there are better instruments. I mean, it's I think you're right. We don't have something that's obviously better right now, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't strive to improve upon what seems to be a flawed instrument in the context of longer-term studies, and that's relevant to disease modification.
I want to make sure that we include the patient perspective. Stephanie, I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on long-term outcome measures and what you think patients would accept as evidence of a long-term benefit, and the uncertainty that might be required if we use a surrogate endpoint for an initial approval.
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to offer my input. So for the question in the Q&A, this goes good with that. So I'm answering it live right now. As far as long-term measures, I answered it to a previous person who put a question in the chat. For a young patient or someone that's considered a young patient, total knee replacement is not going to be an option, or at least in my perspective. Again, this is only my perspective. It's going to wear out by the time, I'm 50. So no, I'm not. I'm not going to do that. Or I would be very, I wouldn't say no. I'd be very hesitant if that's the outcome. If you can decrease pain and maybe minimal structure damage to the knee, or the joint, I should say, yeah, sure, I'd be way more inclined to try a drug, participate in a trial, or anything of that nature. But however, this is, like I said, it's very subjective because of the age. Even when we talk about in terms of the WOMAC, if you're asking someone about sitting on the toilet and they're 30, and I can't barely sit on the toilet, that's gonna bother me a lot more than maybe if I'm 60 and can't sit on the toilet, because it just makes sense, right? So that's my perspective on that. There's been a lot of questions in the chat about the total knee replacement. Are there any other outcome measures that you wanted me to speak about specifically besides the total knee replacement?
I think you answered the question that I was thinking about. So thank you very much. There was a question in the Q&A about alternative imaging outcomes, such as bone marrow edema and synovitis. I wonder if the panelists could speak about these, the extent to which they correspond to clinically meaningful measures, and how sensitive they are to change.
I guess since
you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I'm happy to try to speak about it, and certainly others can too. I mean, as someone who's advocated for moving structural focus away from cartilage, which we published a paper in ARD last year that showed that cartilage loss, at least in OAI, doesn't correspond well to pain worsening, and cartilage preservation doesn't correlate well with pain with no change in pain or with pain improvement. And it just, the two are really very, very poorly related. Bone marrow lesions and synovitis, especially synovitis, correlate better with pain change. And worsening synovitis seems to be correlated pretty well with pain change. And synovitis also seems to increase the risk of cartilage loss. Does that mean that synovitis is the sort of holy grail of the structural biomarker or the structural marker we need to use to assess outcomes in osteoarthritis? I don't know that. I'm not sure the relationship is strong enough to rely on it heavily, I think. And the other issue, and it was one I sort of raised hesitantly in the imaging discussion earlier, is the imaging folks are focusing still on cartilage and cartilage compositional stuff, and synovitis and perfusion of the synovium, dynamic changes within that perfusion seem to explain a large percentage of pain change in at least one trial we did. And that makes a reasonable amount of sense. I don't know whether it can be corroborated in other studies, and whether it's important in predicting structural outcomes. And I am as hesitant as some of the others who've talked about markers. I think there needs to be more data on this. But yeah, synovitis is a promising imaging marker, and bone marrow lesions are promising too, but maybe not at the current time quite as much as synovitis is.
I wonder.
Can I just throw in What was interesting,
Camilla?
what Stephanie said
Oh,
was, sorry, Jeff, was the issue about, I think as a tractable endpoint, I'll come back to the bad patient state. But it's interesting that Stephanie raised the issue of what's important to patient about that there is something improving structure is in somehow meaningful to patients, although it's not really about a field functions and survives. So I think maybe it's almost a third pathway. There's a pure pain pathway. There's a, do you make important difference to how the patient feels, functions and survives? And then there's something else that says mechanistically, we think we did this. That might be related to that endpoint. I don't think they're exclusive. I just agree with the others that I wouldn't be focusing my study on that endpoint alone.
Sharmila.
Sharmila?
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
I actually agree with David Felson. I think he's going to pin this forever. It's being recorded. I do agree with David Felson that inflammation and inflammatory markers seem to play a big role in terms of pain prediction. For example, the phenotyping stuff that Roma presented with the inflammatory pathway in the OAI and some of our results is actually showing that with the inclusion of the inflammatory metrics, pain as well as progression is faster. The unfortunate thing is, though, that with OA, the prevalence of inflammation, synovitis, as well as bone marrow edema is very cyclical, and you won't catch it in different times. It's the natural history of it is such that you may not catch it all the time. In post-traumatic OA, it's most marked initially, and then it disappears. So I think we need a greater understanding of that. And I really feel that I know we are focusing on pain and function, but I just want to point out that I could reduce your pain with inhibiting nerve function by ablating the genu nerve in your knee, but that does not mean that the mechanical onslaught isn't going to cause structural damage, which will require years down the road that you will just not be able to function and you will need a knee replacement. So I really feel it's a very, very complex interaction of structure and function, and I don't think we can eliminate one or the other.
Tim, you have your hand up.
No, I think that's completely right, and that's missing from our equation is the kind of biomechanical function. It makes you wonder if adduction moment should be one of these composite measures rather than necessarily all this imaging.
Now with iPhones, we should be able to do and get a lot of those functional things on the fly with people, right? Get a little accelerator.
Well, well, we designed an app that actually performs physical function tests. People can take it home and do the tests. It records gait speed, chair sit stand, and a kind of get up and go test.
If I may, can I add something?
Please.
Just to add to that point about the cost, risk, benefit, and like the structural damage, I think it depends how much damage are we doing with an intervention, no matter what it is. As a patient, if it's minimal structural damage where maybe I don't feel as much pain or, or something like that, I would say I'm more inclined. However, if you're telling me there's going to be significant damage, again, because my age and I have to live with this so long, then I'm gonna be more hesitant.
Tim.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, that's another trade-off because conceptually, some of these interventions might get you 10 years of less pain and better function, but at the end of the 10 years, bang, you're going to need a knee replacement. So this inflammation discussion is the whole reason I did the corticosteroid trial, 3-month injection every 3 months. And we found no long-term benefit on pain and people lost more cartilage. So,
think it would also, you know, considering the social aspects, of the individual as well. Can this person afford that? You know, if you have young children that you have to run around with, or if you plan on having children, if you're a young patient, well, 10 years later, I might have a 5-year-old. Can I really be in more pain? So I might be a little more hesitant. However, if I'm a little bit older, or maybe I don't plan on having kids, or whatever the case may be, there's so many factors that you could consider. Maybe I'm willing to take that risk.
Thank you. Jeff, we have 9 minutes remaining in this session. Which question should we focus on for the last part of this discussion?
I've been looking at the questions, and I have the sense that we've covered many of the ones that were raised. Anyone in the panel have a question they'd particularly like to focus on?
Marc.
Sure, I'm going to add some controversy for the last 7 or 8 minutes of this. So I put a comment in the chat box, which is, what is inherently wrong with having a joint replacement? Results of hip replacements are on average excellent, and it is a highly cost-effective procedure. Knee replacements on average are very good because we've talked about the residual 20% of people who appear to have nociplastic pain. And maybe they're not as cost effective as hip replacements are. And we focused on hip OA, but this has been on knee OA all day, but it's not in the title of this workshop. So maybe we could talk about hip OA as well. And you know, am I the only one that doesn't think having a joint replacement is, you know, not the worst thing that can happen to you?
I think, Marc,
I'd rather have a joint replacement than a stroke.
I think there's 2 responses, aren't there? Number one is some people don't want a joint replacement. So that's number one. So yes, it's largely a good operation. But secondly, your risks of a revision procedure are very much related to your age when you have your first procedure. So if you're 50 and have a joint replacement, your chances of revision surgery are very, very high. And that revision surgery is not cost effective and comes with disastrous patient outcomes. Can be, you know. So if you're over 65 getting a hip, or 70 getting a hip these days, that is a good outcome. But I think, is your point, what's trying to avoid TJR is not necessarily a good thing? Was that your point?
Yes, I think that's my point.
Yeah.
You know, we consider TJR here as a serious adverse event because you need to be hospitalized for it in a trial, and that's how it was picked up in Cantos.
No, I would not be seeing it as a serious adverse event. I'd be seeing it as a serious event in a person's life, not necessarily an adverse event. But,
right.
But
so
it's a big event.
Yeah. So if Ms. Rosado, instead of being a young woman, was an old woman, okay, or an old man, or an old person, okay, then having a joint replacement, if you're willing to undergo the joint replacement and you otherwise do not disqualify yourself based on the presence of comorbid conditions, it's not the worst thing in the world.
No.
Your analgesic therapy has not been efficacious over time.
But it is a marker that you've reached that stage of quality of life where you've had enough. That's generally, when we talk to patients, that's what they're saying to us. They're saying, I say to them, it's not your pain score, it's not your x-ray, it's how much is it impacting your life. And that's when people suddenly decide to make this change to have the joint replacement, I think. So
right.
I think it's a marker of a bad event or a big event, not an adverse event. But I think you're right. But I don't think having it as an endpoint or part of an endpoint is a bad thing, because you would hope people are, a good therapy would make you, there's not many people want to run into a joint replacement. And if you had a reduction in joint replacement endpoints, I would have thought that still mean patients are happy to stay in where they're at without having to undergo surgery.
I see with a hand up. Tahina, welcome. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Sure, thank you. This has been a really great session, and it's interesting that a lot of the same themes are coming up over and over again across the sessions. I was wondering, since we do have FDA with us today, if, and I apologize if I missed already a comment, and I see Nikolay already smiling, he probably knows what's coming his way. So we're talking a lot about joint replacement as an endpoint. We've talked a lot about structure modification and what are the tissues to target, but from FDA perspective, a patient, the treatment needs to impact how the patient feels, functions, and survives, and joint survival is one of the aspects that joint replacement addresses. If an agent shows that it is reducing joint replacement, is that considered evidence of demode from FDA perspective? Would an indication be different for a treatment that is demonstrating that? And I think another area that the community is really struggling is really understanding beyond how a patient feels and functions with pain and function endpoints, how to move towards structure and demode indication.
Thanks, Tahina. I guess this question was addressed to me, so I'll try to respond to that. So I think I'm really grateful for this discussion today altogether, because it kind of highlighted some of the areas of struggles that we also at the FDA have in how to approach proposals for drug developments for products that are intended to modify the disease. And I think one of the struggles that we have is what exactly is a disease modification? What is the ultimate goalpost of showing the benefits for patients in a long run? Again, we're not talking about the analgesics, which are being used and approved currently, but disease, products that are intended to change this natural history of the disease. And I think having a good understanding of what really this goalpost is critical for us. And by goalpost, I mean, what would the patient benefit at the end of the day? And I think that's why this last discussion is critical to think about what exactly would these products do for these patients. And again, we've taken on its face joint replacement as sort of important clinically relevant endpoints, but again, trying to see if we can capture something more or earlier to make these studies feasible. And I think given the discussion now, it's not clear to me that we have a good understanding of what this benefit would be. So how we call these these products or in the indications, ultimately that's more of a semantics maybe, whether we call them demodes, what the claims might be. I think these are sort of secondary points for discussion. But I think the critical question that we have is how are these treatments going to help patients? And then we can think about what else can we look at earlier on to know that if we change, say, cartilage or synovitis or bone marrow lesions or something else, or biochemical markers, how would these translate into this benefit so that we don't need to do these larger and longer trials? And I really want to thank Phil for bringing the discussion back to sort of the framing of drug development in that area. We have examples as we discussed or was discussed for osteoporosis drugs that we believe in a highly prevalent disease like osteoarthritis should be doable and achievable as a goal. So I'll pause here. I don't know if that answered your question.
Philip has said many times that osteoarthritis is like osteoporosis in many ways, mechanistically. Philip, do you want to say a couple of words?
I guess I'm going to stick with Tahina's theme at present, because I think the label is important to pharma. It's not what patients, but I think I'm being upfront when I say that label is important. So, but I think if we reduce the rate of TJR or a bad state, then that's something about reducing disease progression, because that to me is where things progress to with patients over time, is that over time they head towards joint replacement. So that to me, so I mightn't use the phrase structure modification, but I might use the phrase modifies disease progression. So alleviate symptoms and modify. Is that where you're sort of thinking, Nikolay? Is that, and I won't put words in your mouth.
Yeah, so again, I can only speak for myself because I'm not really sure that that reflects the thinking of others in the agency. But currently approved treatments are approved for treatment of pain of osteoarthritis, or pain and function, or some caveat or qualifier. To me, a treatment that really treats the underlying disease would be a treatment of osteoarthritis. And if that's what it takes, to show that this really treats the underlying disease, I think that's certainly a reasonable indication. I don't know how to define structural and structural progression or benefit on structural endpoints, because I don't think we understand what is the progression of the disease, how to define that progression to try to carve out a specific indication for structural benefit, for example. Again, these are just thoughts. I'm not sure that these have been discussed broadly within the agency, and I see others. I see Larissa also on the call, so maybe she has her thoughts from CBER perspective.
Well, thanks, Nikolay. It's not really from any perspective. It's from the perspective of changing the disease course. I think what we're all trying to say in more, simple definition of this, if we have a product that changes the course of the disease, that natural disease course, and by natural, of course, in the modern times, is going to be not just a completely untreated disease, it's going to be the disease treated with the available therapies. But if we have a product that changes the course, delays progression of osteoarthritis, improves cartilage regrowth, does something that truly can decrease the burden associated with the disease progression, changes the course of natural worsening that happens with time, then that would be the product which we will call however we want to call it, disease modifying or regenerative medicine therapies. I come from the world of biologics. We're all into the regenerative medicines there. So, but really changing the course of the disease, that's how I would summarize it.
Yeah, and just one maybe point of clarification for the DMARDs that are used as a terminology for treatments of rheumatoid arthritis. I'm not sure that there's certainly not a regulatory definition of that, but I'm not even sure that there is a good definition out there, because we looked at this a while back, what exactly a DMARD is, other than changing the underlying disease, the trajectory of the disease, which is more of a concept rather than specific data supporting that.
David may want to jump in on this, but it came out of the early GOLD studies, where it showed there was reduction in erosion progression. So that was where the concept, I think, first arose, was out of the GOLD.
Right. But I would think of what's more important to patients is not really the erosion, but the fact that they're not really sitting in the wheelchairs and disabled. I think that's really what's the benefit to patients. And I don't know how strong the data are to support that, but just by gestalt, by experience, we know that these treatments have revolutionized the treatment of RA, the management of RA, and we don't see these patients anymore.
I think that, the huge difference is that in that disease, inflammation and damage are so tightly linked, and that's the difference.
Right.
Okay, I think we can now end session 3.